I'm going to be presenting about DApps and how we curate them potentially. There's sort of two different ideas on the table at the moment, and I'll be presenting one in which we use curation curves and some ideas from bonded tokens to think about how we might rank DApps in our store. So as you all know, the best place to start a presentation is with the cute Doge, but we're now on mainnet, and so one of the next big problems that we have to face is figuring out not only what optimized for status might mean for different DApps, but also how they actually rank in our store and how users can discover them in different contexts and do that easily and intuitively without needing to go through a whole educational rigmarole around understanding what it is that they're doing. So in order to sort of answer this, I think the best place is to start with some history. And the best question to ask is what made PageRank famous, which is the algorithm that Google uses to index their searches. And I think that the core insight here is a quote from Marshall McLuhan, who once said that the medium is the message. And Larry Page and Sergey Brin certainly recognized this in the early 2000s when they came to the idea that the central problem facing the web at that time was not getting documents to display as we might expect them to in the real world, which is what everybody else was trying to do at the time, but rather organizing the fire hose of information that the web was generating through this sort of massive collaboration and creative explosion that was going on. And that's what sort of led to PageRank, and you can see a really simplified version of that. It's obviously much more complicated these days, but the basic idea is that any page has sort of incoming and outgoing links, and the number of incoming links is what's most important to how it ranks, the weights that it is given by the algorithm, and therefore how highly it ranks in your search. Obviously, that is manipulated, though, by advertising in particular, and the other big point is that you don't get to see the inner workings of PageRank. You just sort of have to believe Google and trust them to do this weighting correctly. And that's kind of the central problem now, isn't it? That it's no longer a question of just organizing information. It's about who gets to organize the information, how they present it to the users, and what they choose to leave out. So it's really about what personalization means in a world of targeted ads, political manipulation, and what is essentially a total lack of privacy. I think a lot of people in status, particularly through some of the discussions around analytics and Mixpanel, have come to the recognition that data tracking and understanding how a product is used is not necessarily a bad thing at all. It's in fact, incredibly beneficial to making a much more user-friendly experience in general and understanding where it is that we're already losing people in the journey to Web3. But we need to be really, really careful about what data it is that we're tracking and how we personalize services. And in fact, what personalization really means, particularly when we're faced with the possibility of, pseudo-anonymous, decentralized global networks operating at scale. So how do we solve this problem? Well, token curated registries are one possible option. I wanted to include that neat picture because I think it's pretty awesome. But you'll see here, this is one of the early beta versions of the ad chain token curated registry for advertisers and the content that they publish. And I'm a massive fan of Mike Golden and the guys at AdChain. I think that they're pretty intelligent people. But you can see here that even though it's like a pretty well put together interface, it's really, really complex. There's all sorts of things that you need to understand in order to even approach this interface, right? There's this concept of tokens on the left-hand side. Then you've got the various different stages that they need to go through in voting and getting into the registry or revealing later being rejected. And then there's all sorts of complications around handling those, and it requires various different on-chain transactions. And it really is like quite a burden on the user when we think about, how do we make this stuff easy for people to use? I'm not sure that this is the answer. So what do we really need? Well, basically, it's just that the information that appears in whatever I'm trying to search for must be what's most relevant to me. The organizations that are responsible for that information must be providing the most value to me and my community. Nothing must be missing from the list, or if something is missing from the list, it should be easy for me to inspect that and understand why. And I should be able to influence the list should I really want to. Those are the basic user needs that I think any user has approaching a modern search. So in general, and you can see it in that ad chain interface, when people think about trying to meet those user needs, they're like, oh, okay, cool. We need to decentralize how we curate information. So let's just hand that burden off to the community. But that's precisely the wrong way to think about it, because A, it is a burden, and B, the whole point of designing decentralized systems, of engaging in mechanism design for cryptography and economics, is precisely to make sure that no single party has control over the system, not even the community. And what's more is that people then go ahead and say, because it's so complicated and there's a burden on the user, we're going to have to incentivize them with the use of rewards and tokens. And that adds just another layer of complexity to the thing, because now not only do I have to issue and receive perhaps another on-chain transaction, I also have to know what to do with that token. There's just going to be this endless accumulation of tokens in my wallet that I don't really know what to do with. And that's quite a concern when we think about mass adoption of systems like Ethereum as well. So sort of suggested moving towards a more accurate consumer crypto economics, which is sort of based around this primal assertion that's the whole point of mechanism design of crypto economics is to make sure that there's no single central point of failure, including the community. And I think that this is a really, really key point, right? That decentralization is the goal and egalitarianism is a great success metric. But that's not true the other way around, because egalitarianism is not a function that can be mapped accurately in a mathematical way and therefore optimized to achieve certain ends, whereas decentralization is. So we make decentralization the goal, and then how egalitarian the system is that results is how we measure success. And it's really, really important that we do it that way around. One sort of last note on this is that there's this book doing the rounds at the moment called Radical Markets, written by Glenn Weil and Eric Posner. There's a podcast with me and Glenn coming out soon. And the key sort of insight here is when I say point 2 here, the organizations responsible for the information must be providing the most value. And what do I really mean by that? Is it views on a video? Is it user reviews for a book? Is it star rating systems and other reputation systems? But generally speaking, at least on centralized platforms, unlike the Silk Road, these systems tend to be very, very easy to manipulate. It's very easy to buy Twitter followers or to buy views for your YouTube videos or various other things that can then be used to influence these advertising metrics, because again, the whole system is trying to optimize for the wrong thing, which is advertising revenue and user information, rather than collaboration and creativity and the sort of move toward a collective kind of knowledge that's actually curated and interesting to a large community of people. The key point and the reason that Radical Markets is on this slide is because free markets and pure price discovery mechanisms have proven time and time again to be the most effective means of allocating resources that we have discovered as a species. So free markets and price discovery mechanisms are really what's most important to thinking about some of the economic systems that it's now possible to introduce on these networks. So for our DApp curation store, let's implement the most radically free market we can, and say simply that whoever stakes the most SNT to rank in the DApp store ranks the highest. It really is as simple as that. And we only introduce one very important caveat to this game. Pure price discovery mechanisms are open to manipulation by people who have lots of money, obviously, right? So they work very, very well, but in already unequal societies, they're open to various kinds of manipulation, which is precisely why we have regulation and anti-monopoly laws in place. Those things are useful. There's a good history behind them that you can go in and look into. But the point here is that we don't want human regulation, right? We want maths. That's the core insight of Bitcoin. We don't necessarily need a whole bunch of human bodies and generally agreed accounting principles and King 4 and whatever else this stuff is. We can just use maths and cryptography to regulate the systems that we use and allow for this trustless execution of arbitrary code, which is the feature of Ethereum. So we'll make this rule that whoever stakes the most SNT ranks the highest, with the one caveat that the more SNT you stake as a developer to rank highly, the easier it is for the community to influence that position. And in order to achieve that, we're going to have to use this one idea from TCRs, not the whole gamut, just one idea, which is bonded curves. I'll come back to this slide, but this is basically what I'm talking about, right? So you can see that the x-axis down here is the SNT that is staked per DApp, and the y-axis is the number of votes minted per SNT that is staked. So the more SNT that you're staking as a developer to rank highly in the store, the more votes are minted against your product, which can then be used to either upvotes or downvotes in the store. And I'll get into the UX in a little while. If you're interested, the curve that I'm using is also detailed on the slide. What's most important about it is that the exponent is fractional, because that's what results in an exponential area when you integrate it. I'll come back to that slide at the end. So what we can then do in terms of constructing these graphs and actually understanding how we're going to achieve those 4 features that I said were key for any user. The first thing that we have to do is map the cost that it actually has to mint these votes in order to upvote or downvote a DApp in our store. You can see that that's also a decreasing exponential function. It's just the inverse of the number of tokens that are printed. I mean, the number of votes that are printed. And like, here's some extra detail in case you're struggling to follow along. So for every SNT you stake to rank in the store, a certain number of votes are minted. The more SNT you stake, the more votes are minted using that exponential curve that I just showed you. Those votes can then be bought by anyone and used to either upvote or downvote your DApp. It costs people to buy those votes, and that cost goes directly back to the developer, but that's a part that I'll come to in another slide. Importantly, the more votes that have already been cast, the more expensive it is to mint further votes. When someone downvotes your DApp, that does subtract value from your effective balance, which is the thing that is used to rank DApps in the store. So this is why this idea to me is so exciting, because you can imagine having a separate tab in status for DApps, and all that this would require is introducing a balance below each DApp so that it's clear to the user who has paid what to rank where they do in the rankings, and then a little upvote and downvote button on the side of every DApp, which people already know because they use it on Reddit and various other forums across the internet. Importantly, upvotes have no effect on the rankings, but they do make it more expensive for others to downvote. And there's good game theoretic reasons for that, which you can ask me afterwards. So this is beginning to sort of map out some of these subtleties, right? Instead of just having the red, like the red cost curve and the blue number of votes to mint curve, we then say, unfortunately, not all of the SNT that is staked by DApp developers to rank in the store can actually be available to mint votes with, because it leads to another kind of attack. So we have to say that only a certain percentage of the SNT that is staked is actually available to mint votes with. And the problem is, how do we specify that percentage? How do we know what's best, right? Because the higher the percentage is, like the more of the SNT that is staked that can be used to mint votes with, the slower SNT will accumulate in the registry, and the total SNT in the DApp store is a really good proxy for the overall crypto economic security of the entire store. So we would generally want it to be like a little bit lower, the percentage available. Here you can see it's 62.5%. But we want to try and make sure that it's as high as possible, because obviously the more SNT that you've staked with that is available to be voted with by the community, the the more that you stand to earn back as a developer, right? Because as I mentioned, it costs people to actually vote on your DApp, and that cost goes directly back to the developer. It doesn't touch status. It doesn't go into contracts. If you buy votes on a certain DApp by either clicking up votes or down votes, that cost in S&T goes directly back to the developer. So we've done that, and you can see that the new curves here are the orange ones, so there's slightly less S&T minted, slightly less votes minted per S&T, which is what you'd expect because we're only using a certain percentage. And that means that the cost is slightly higher, that green line, which is great. We're getting closer. Now we need to implement the last little subtlety, which was that the more votes that have been cast, the more expensive it is to mint further votes, right? Because ideally speaking, what you'd want is the closer that your vote gets to actually moving the DApp in the store, to actually having a certain effect on the actual rankings, the more expensive it should be to vote. But there's no easy way to measure that accurately. So because we're using these smooth exponential curves, we can apply the same thinking, and the more votes that have been cast already as a percentage also should affect how expensive it is to mint further votes. So it makes it more expensive, and you can see the final lines here are the purple one and the light blue one. So that seems to have got us quite close to what we need for the system to work. And this is one of the key points, right? That even better, whatever it costs the users of the community to vote goes directly back to the developer. So it means that, like, even if we start a DApp wars situation, or developers become victims of trolling or corporate warfare or targeted community campaigns, they still receive the value that they stake back as they move down the rankings, right? So it results in this really interesting game theoretic equilibrium. And there's a cool cartoon about that, just because we can't be serious the whole time. So due to some possible attacks, which I can detail in a question and answer session, perhaps, only that certain percentage, as I mentioned, of what the developer stakes is actually available to mint votes with. And I think that the key points here, right, is we asked earlier, how do we actually measure what provides the most value to the organization? Like, what does that mean, most value? Is it user reviews? Is it viewings? Is it ratings? What is it? Well, in this system, the more S&T that has been staked overall by all the developers to rank their DApps, the less S&T there is in circulation, which means that there's a higher demand per S&T, which means that there is literally, and I do mean it quite literally, greater value for S&T holders, right? So you can be sure when you're looking at the rankings, okay, MakerDAO ranks first and they stake this much S&T. That much S&T has effectively been removed from circulation, and therefore they are contributing directly to value that I also am a part of as an S&T holder. So it's really, really interesting, you know, we'll stay here. It's really interesting that this is a sort of side effects of how we design decentralized systems. And it brings me back to what I was saying, that, like, decentralization is the goal. Egalitarianism is a great success metric. And you might be asking, you know, what are the incentives for the user here? Why are they going to ever interact with the system? Because it actually costs them to vote. But that's kind of precisely the point. Right? If you think about our current systems at the moment, you don't want to have to actually go and vote on every single Google link that appears in your search. It doesn't make sense, and nobody really wants to do that. You just want to be sure that the links that appear in your search are the most relevant to you and that nobody's manipulating them. This is exactly the same system, right? Just implemented in a crypto economic context, where I can be sure that the ranking that I am seeing on whatever page I'm looking at to discover DApps is purely transparent and contributing value to me. And in addition to that, if I feel really, really strongly about the ranking of a certain product, either that it should move up or down in the app, in the list that I'm looking at, then I can influence that, but it costs me to do so. And that seems correct. And that cost doesn't go to a centralized company like Google or Amazon or Facebook. It doesn't go to status. It goes directly back to the developer, right? So it becomes, in a sense, like you have to pay to complain, or when you're upvoting, essentially it's a decentralized patronage system for DApps, which is really, really interesting again. And this sort of brings me back, finally, I put this in the wrong place, to the difference between curation and discovery, right? What are the pros and cons here? And obviously, like, I'm deeply biased in this. And I don't know huge amounts about discovery and using various things like the Tribler protocol, which is a way of indexing content on BitTorrent. And it's already sort of, so like I say, I'm a little bit biased, but this is the list, right? For curation, it's easy to implement. I'll show you the link to the smart contract that is mostly written. There's one line that's we still need to do a little bit of work on. It's a great SNT use case. And that also applies to analytics, right? So Chad was making the point in the analytics channel earlier that, in fact, you know, when we're looking at ways of gathering data in a decentralized fashion and using that usefully in terms of figuring out where people are actually getting the best use from status, then, you know, having more SNC use cases is really, really useful for that, because it's easy to measure and it's all publicly available on the chain. Also, the UI implementation is fairly clear, right? All it requires is a new tab for DApps, which has been requested by a lot of users anyway, because they say that they clog up and confuse the main page. Those DApps just need to have a small little like amount next to their name, and then two little buttons to upvote or downvotes, and that allows the community to both interact with the list and make it clear without clogging the whole thing why it is that a DApp is in a certain position. There's one smart contract, which is mostly already written, and, you know, one of the difficulties with this is that it's going to be very hard to personalize and filter. But, you know, hopefully with one smart contract, it should be easy to either extend that or adopt a new system without too much trouble. It's on the other side, in terms of discovery, there's a lot of research still to be done. If Goran is listening, it would be great to get the discovery doc. That would be super useful to try and understand where the next research points would be. I think there are quite a lot of privacy concerns around storing some part of your browsing or usage history and then gossiping that to peers so that they can create their own partial indices, which is what I understand of how these sort of algorithms work. I'm unsure how we would make it clear why certain DApps rank highly and others don't using that kind of system. And it's likely that there's a lot of implementation details in our own protocols that we would need to discuss, and that implementing that kind of system would be a longer term vision. Although there are some really, really interesting things there. And the fact that we're using Whisper and that we already wrote a fairly naive version 1 of this discovery protocol, there has been a lot of work done there. I'm just not too aware of it. So I'm very open to discussion about what the actual benefits are there, because this is a biased slide. If you would like, the smart contract is here. Me and Richard have been working on it. You can go and take a look. It's just over 100 lines of code, which I think is pretty exciting. And the conclusion to all of this, right, is that tokens are just these abstract data structures, guys, which means that we can perform mathematical operations on them. And that's nothing that's particularly new. You know, I think what's key, and the reason that I've called them votes in the system and not tokens, is precisely to sort of like show up this feature that they are just these abstract data structures against which we can perform mathematical operations. You know, you don't have to think about them literally, and you don't have to literally like move them into the user's wallet and try and figure out how you're going to associate real world value to this and then get the user to interact with it and exchange it for other tokens or exchange it for US dollars, or figure out how to actually like extract real world value and utility from it. All you need is this abstract data structure that you can perform mathematical operations against, which is those curves that I showed you, and then get the results back and use that in a decentralized and transparent fashion. So the aim of curating information without any central authority should be to design and build systems that cannot be coerced by any group, including the community, especially the community. And it's such a vague and overused term anyway. Tokenizing information is a great way to do that, but not when you take it literally. as that complicates both the incentives and the UI enormously. You know, and I think the other sort of feature here is not only what are the incentives for the user because they actually have to pay to vote in the system, but what are the incentives for the developer? Well, developers are already paying for things like AdWords and SEO to rank highly on Google. So like it's a very similar system again, like they have to pay to rank, except that money doesn't go to Google or a centralized entity. It gets stored in the smart contracts and is effectively locked out of circulation. So it contributes value back to the entire community. And developers stand to earn a significant portion of that back through community votes, whether they're positive or negative. So it's not like you can earn money back from SEO or AdWords if lots of people use it. You might be able to do that with AdWords. I think I saw an update about that, but certainly not SEO. That money just goes to Google or whoever's doing your SEO. In this system, you actually stand to earn a lot of what you stake back if you can get the community to actually interact with it. Importantly, and I know I've mentioned this, but I'll just emphasize it one last time, the user benefits as a side effect of the optimal and decentralized curation of information, much like they do now, right? Except that how the info is ranked is totally transparent and they can affect it if they should really desire to. The developer also stands to earn back that significant portion of what they stake. And the community benefits from the amount of SNT in total that is staked in the DApp store because that is removed from circulation. It's a great token sink. Go and read Movements of Equity Tokens by Vitalik. It's a great piece on his blog. It's vitalik.ca. And that's it. So thanks for listening. If there are any questions, we've got 5 minutes. It doesn't seem like it. So I think we'll stop the live stream and thank you so much for checking in. We'll see you next week for a talk with Julian about the API and some extensions, I think, which is really, really exciting. So same time, same place next week. Take it easy.